Some voices do not simply fill a room. They reach into something that has been sitting quietly inside a person, waiting for the right note, the right lyric, the right harmony to unlock it all at once. Anyone who has ever sat in a darkened auditorium listening to gospel music knows exactly what that feeling is, and it has nothing to do with entertainment. It is closer to recognition, like the music is confirming a truth you already carried but had never heard spoken aloud. Very few performers in gospel music history have created that feeling as consistently or as genuinely as the men who stood on the stage of the Gaither Vocal Band. And among all the voices that filled those stages over the decades, two names stay with fans in a way that time has not softened. Guy Penrod and Wes Hampton were not simply singers. They carried something much larger than themselves, and the full story of what happened between them, around them, and because of them, is one the gospel music world has never completely told from beginning to end. What most fans witnessed was the music. What they never saw was everything behind it. The exhaustion hiding behind the smiles, the physical collapse that nobody was permitted to discuss publicly, the brotherhood that grew in quiet hotel rooms and backstage hallways where no cameras rolled, and the prayer that happened before every single performance, not as routine, but as a genuine and sometimes desperate conversation with God. And then there was the moment devastating and defining all at once, when one of the most beloved voices in gospel music history had to walk away from the stage he had given everything to, not because he wanted to leave, but because staying might have cost him the only thing that made staying worth anything at all. This is that story, and nothing has been left out. To understand who Guy Penrod became inside the Gaither Vocal Band, you first have to understand what he represented before he ever sang a single note with the group. Gospel music has always demanded a specific emotional honesty that talent alone cannot manufacture. Perfect pitch and flawless technique mean nothing if the person standing at the microphone does not genuinely believe the words coming out of their mouth, and gospel audiences have always been able to tell the difference immediately. Penrod believed deeply and without performance, and you could hear it in every single note he produced. His baritone voice carried a texture that is almost impossible to describe without hearing it directly, warm and commanding at the same time, the kind of voice that fills a room not through volume but through weight. When Penrod sang, there was substance behind every phrase, nothing performed for the sake of performance, everything delivered like testimony from a man who had lived the words. His arrival at the Gaither Vocal Band came in the mid-1990s, and he stepped into a group that was already well established in the Christian music world, but still growing into its full identity. Bill Gaither, the founder and constant creative force behind everything the group represented, had spent years building something that went far beyond a standard singing ensemble. The Gaither Vocal Band operated as a ministry first and a musical act second, and the famous Gaither Homecoming video series had already introduced millions of gospel music fans to a warm, communal approach to Christian music that felt personal and real, rather than polished and distant. Penrod fit into that world without effort. His presence was never cold or theatrical, and he carried the rare ability to stand before thousands of people and make each individual in the audience feel as though the song was being sung directly to them. That is not a skill anyone teaches. A performer either has it or they do not, and Penrod had it in a measure that very few artists ever reach. The years following his arrival filled up with recordings, concert tours, and the kind of sustained creative output that builds a legacy one performance at a time. Those Gaither Homecoming videos reached into homes across the country and around the world, bringing gospel music into living rooms and church halls where full concert attendance was not always possible. Penrod appeared across many of those recordings, and his performances became some of the most watched moments in the entire catalog. Fans memorized the songs he led, shared the videos with family and friends, and brought their children to concerts specifically to hear his voice live. Over time, Penrod did not simply belong to the Gaither Vocal Band, he became one of its defining symbols, someone whose name and voice were inseparable from what the group meant to its most devoted listeners. But life inside a major touring gospel ministry carries nothing of the serenity that the music itself might suggest. Maintaining a concert schedule at the level the Gaither Vocal Band operated requires a physical and emotional output that most fans never think about, and none of that thinking is pleasant when you actually sit with it. Consider what it means to perform night after night, week after week, in different cities and different time zones and different venues, always with the expectation that the performance will be exceptional and the spirit will be genuine. Singers working at that level are not employees clocking in for a shift. They are people who have built their entire identity around the belief that what they do carries spiritual weight, which means every substandard performance registers as more than a professional disappointment. It lands as a failure of calling, a failure of faith. That specific emotional pressure belongs uniquely to gospel ministry, and it accumulates quietly inside a performer across months and years until the total weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. For Penrod specifically, the physical demands of touring created very real dangers for the instrument his entire life depended on. A singer's voice is not machinery, it is living tissue that responds to sleep, to hydration, to stress, to temperature changes, to illness, and above all to overuse. Professional singers who perform regularly learn the constant discipline required to protect their voices. Strict routines around food and drink, deliberate rest between shows, careful avoidance of environments that cause vocal strain. None of that protective routine survives easily when a touring schedule grows heavy enough. Late nights, early travel calls, shifting weather conditions, and the steady exhaustion of extended time away from homework, together to undermine even the most careful vocal health practices. Penrod had been living inside that demanding cycle for well over a decade, by the time the effects started compounding in ways that could no longer be managed through sheer determination. When Wes Hampton joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2005, the weight attached to that role was not subtle. The tenor position Hampton stepped into had previously belonged to David Phelps, a Christian singer whose voice had earned a worldwide reputation for its astonishing range and technical beauty. Filling that position after such a celebrated predecessor would have unsettled almost anyone, but Hampton brought something entirely his own to the role rather than attempting any kind of imitation. His tenor voice held a brightness and clarity that caught audiences immediately, and his stage personality was warm, joyful, and completely unforced. He did not try to be David Phelps, he simply tried to be himself, and that honesty turned out to be exactly what the Gaither Vocal Band needed at that point in its history. Hampton's arrival also brought something to the personal chemistry of the group that nobody could have fully predicted. When new members join an ensemble with deep existing relationships, the chemistry either absorbs them naturally or resists them, sometimes without anyone understanding why. With Hampton, the absorption happened quickly and genuinely. He connected with people fast, and the other members of the group responded with warmth rather than reservation. His friendship with Penrod developed the way road friendships always do, not through a single meaningful conversation, but through the slow accumulation of shared hours in unremarkable places. Long bus rides between cities, quiet airport terminals before early flights, sound checks in empty venues with no audience present, late-night conversations in hotel lobbies where the only thing left to do was talk. These are the environments where real friendships form between touring musicians, and for Penrod and Hampton, those environments became the foundation of a bond that went well past professional respect. They spoke openly about faith during the hours between performances, and they prayed together before shows with a regularity that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine preparation. Hampton later described those pre-concert moments as some of the most meaningful of his career, and the reason he gave was telling. They were not dramatic or emotional in the way outsiders might imagine. They were honest. Two men setting their individual worries and questions and hopes before God, and then walking out under the stage lights to sing about the truths they had just been quietly wrestling with in private. That combination of personal sincerity and public ministry sat at the heart of what separated the Gaither Vocal Band experience from other gospel music performances, and both Penrod and Hampton embodied it in ways that audiences could feel without ever knowing the specific details behind it. As the years continued and the touring schedule stayed relentless, something was shifting inside Guy Penrod that he pushed past for as long as he could. The exhaustion that had been building gradually became harder to hide from himself, even as he continued delivering performances that gave audiences no indication anything had changed. Recovery time after each concert stretched longer than it used to. Mornings after late-night shows arrived harder than they had even a year before. The vocal strain that any experienced singer learns to recognize and manage was becoming something that rest alone could not resolve, and the cumulative effect of years without genuine recovery was settling into his body in ways that discipline and faith could not hold back indefinitely. And then came the moment that changed everything. Not on a concert stage in front of thousands of people, but in a rehearsal room, at what was supposed to be a low-pressure environment where voices warm up rather than push to their limits. During that rehearsal, Penrod found himself struggling to breathe properly while singing, and for a man who had spent his entire adult life producing power through that voice with apparent ease, the experience landed somewhere between alarming and terrifying. The body had delivered a message that could not be ignored, postponed, or worked around. Medical evaluation confirmed what that rehearsal moment had already suggested. The combination of vocal strain and physical exhaustion had reached a point that could not simply be resolved by taking a weekend off from touring. Penrod faced a genuine health crisis, and the doctors he consulted spoke directly about what continuing at the current pace would ultimately cost him. The risk was not reduced performance quality or increased discomfort, the risk was permanent damage to his voice. For a person whose entire life, whose calling, whose sense of identity had been built around the ability to sing, that possibility was not an abstract professional concern. It threatened something that felt essential to who he was at the most fundamental level. The decision that faced him was one of the most painful a performer in his position can encounter. Walk away from the stage that had given his life so much meaning, or stay on that stage and risk never being able to stand on it again. The announcement that reached gospel music fans in early 2009 carried the careful language these announcements always use: professional, gracious, full of phrases about new opportunities and personal projects that leave plenty of room for interpretation. The community of listeners who had followed the Gaither Vocal Band for years processed the news with a mixture of sadness, confusion, and quiet worry. Penrod had been too central to the group's identity for his departure to feel routine, and the devoted gospel music audience that had followed his career across more than a decade sensed immediately that something more significant than a standard career transition had occurred. Speculation was inevitable, as it always is when a beloved public figure exits a prominent role without complete transparency. But the truth behind the departure, once it became more widely understood, contained no conflict, no broken relationships, no hidden drama. What it contained was the story of a man choosing his health, his family, and his long-term ability to serve over the immediate demands of a ministry he loved deeply and had given everything to serve. For Wes Hampton and the remaining members of the group, the absence of Penrod created a gap that every performance after his departure carried. The harmonies still worked. Concerts still drew devoted audiences across the Christian music world. The ministry continued without interruption, as it had through every lineup change in the group's long history. But the specific texture of the sound had shifted, and the members who had shared years on the road with Penrod understood exactly what had changed. Hampton spoke later about how much Penrod's presence had shaped the experience of singing with the group, not only through his voice but through the spirit he brought to every rehearsal, every prayer session, every backstage moment when the real preparation happened out of audience view. Losing that presence was not a lineup adjustment. It marked the end of a specific chapter, and everyone who had lived through that chapter felt it close. The months following Penrod's departure gave him something he had not genuinely possessed in years, and the word for it is simply space. Space to sleep without an alarm scheduled around a flight. Space to sit with his family through ordinary mornings that did not have to end because of travel. Space to pray without a performance waiting on the other side. And space to honestly examine what years of relentless touring had done to his relationship with the music itself. In later interviews, Penrod described a realization that arrived during that quiet period, the understanding that somewhere along the way, the performance had gradually overtaken the worship. Not through dishonesty or cynicism, but in the way any deeply committed person can find themselves doing the right thing for genuine reasons, and still slowly lose touch with the interior life that makes the right thing meaningful. He had been singing at full volume for so long that the silence between the notes had disappeared. That time away from the stage gave him back that silence, and what he found inside it helped him understand his calling more clearly than any of the busy seasons of his career had ever allowed. The solo work Penrod produced after his departure carried a quality that fans noticed and commented on widely. The voice was still there, restored and protected by the care that leaving had made possible. And something additional lived in those performances that had been harder to detect before, a quietness underneath the power. The sound of a man singing from a place of genuine rest rather than the sustained forward momentum of a packed touring schedule. The songs he chose for his solo recordings reflected the lessons of that period in ways that listeners connected with personally. They were songs about surrender and grace, and the value of being still, themes that years on the road had given him a deeply personal understanding of, and that understanding came through in every note. Meanwhile, Wes Hampton continued building his place in the Gaither Vocal Band's ongoing story, eventually becoming one of the group's most consistent and well-loved voices. Bill Gaither, whose vision had guided the group through every season of change across its long history in Christian music, continued steering the ministry forward with the same focus on authentic faith-based performance that had defined the Gaither homecoming tradition from the beginning. The group's lineup evolved as it always had, with new members bringing different personalities and vocal styles, while the mission itself stayed constant, sharing faith through music and bringing messages of hope to audiences in churches and concert halls across the country. Hampton's joyful energy and strong tenor voice helped maintain the spirit that audiences had come to associate with the group, even as the broader Christian music landscape shifted and new styles emerged around it. His years in the group were shaped significantly by the friendship and shared values he had carried through his time alongside Penrod, and the things they had discussed during long hours of travel became part of the foundation Hampton brought to everything he did on and off the stage. What stays with you, when you step back and look at this entire story from beginning to end, is not the departure itself, or the solo comeback, or the lineup changes that mark different chapters of the group's history. What stays with you is the quieter truth running underneath all of it. Two men, given exceptional gifts and exceptional platforms, chose to use those gifts in service of something larger than their individual careers. They struggled with the demands that service placed on their bodies and their spirits. They supported each other through seasons that tested their endurance and their faith in ways that audiences never witnessed. They made difficult decisions at difficult moments, not because the decisions were easy, but because their integrity required making them. And in doing all of that, they created music and memories that have outlasted every specific lineup and every particular season of the group's history. The Gaither Homecoming recordings exist, preserving those performances for listeners who were not even born when Penrod first stepped onto that stage. The voices are preserved, the performances live in the memories of everyone who was present, and the friendship between two gospel singers who traveled the world together, sharing a message of hope, remains quietly and without needing to announce itself, as the truest evidence that the music they sang was not professional output dressed up as ministry. It was the genuine expression of lives committed to something worth giving everything for, and that is a story that gospel music will carry forward for a long time to come.